Well, welcome. Today, I am going to perhaps take a detour from the general theme of the conversations that we have been having over the last few sessions. In the prior session that I spoke about yesterday, I talked about the marketplace and the fact that we make a mistake of thinking that there is one marketplace when it comes to relationships. I started by explaining that the marketplace was or consisted of two distinct sub marketplaces. One is what I call the dating marketplace, and the second is the marriage marketplace. I'd like to talk about a subject that I think a lot of people might find intriguing because whether it be we respectively or people we know, I believe that today's session would be one you can relate to either in the first person or through the lived life or the lived experiences of another. I am going to be talking about interracial dating or interracial marriages. Interestingly, I made a distinction in the prior session by emphasizing that for young men, it's important to play both marketplaces differently. The motivations of the participants in both markets are not the same. People transition from one marketplace to another. Historically, we used to find that we never dated. Dating is a relatively 20th century concept. Prior to the 20th century, people got married. We had a lot of arranged marriages. We had a lot of family inspired marriages. We had a lot of marriages that were based on business, contracts, wealth, and a host of other motivations. But we did not date. The whole concept of kissing and having sex is something that is relatively modern. However, we are where we are in the world today, and particularly in the West, in the developed West, dating is something that is done from as young as 13 and 14 years. We have people who are 13 years old having sex. As a matter of fact, people as young as 13 and 14 are pretty wild when it comes to their sexual, you might call it, I wouldn't use the word experience, but capabilities. In part, that has come about as a result of the internet, where people can learn behaviors and acts that was usually exclusive to a very small group of people or exclusive to people who were married. In any case, it doesn't really matter. We have a dating marketplace and we have a marriage marketplace. But when it comes to interracial dating, usually it begins in the dating marketplace. Seldom does one person say, I'm going to go from my tribe to another tribe to find a wife. Or seldom do people say, I will leave my ethnic group and pursue someone else in a different ethnic group for marriage. So usually it begins with two individual people meeting each other, let's say falling in love, and deciding to spend the rest of their lives together. Now let me make a few, opening remarks, which is that my position about marriage remains unchanged. Primarily, I think, in the modern West today, there is no benefit to men getting married. I can understand for those who want to have a family, and therefore, within the context of that desire and limitation, there is an important decision to be made that you should follow the right process and have a family for the well-being and for the benefit of the kids. There is no benefit to men being married in the modern West. There is also no benefit to women. There is, however, the right incentives, the right protection, the right motivations for women to get married, because in the event of a failure, the woman actually has a lot to gain compared to what the man stands to gain. Usually women come out of a divorce in relation to financial issues and issues with custody of the kids. They come out more favorably. So although there is no benefit to women getting married, there is an incentive. There is a fail-safe package waiting if something goes wrong. Now what this means is, personally, in my opinion, I have no interest in talking about interracial dating from the dating marketplace, because I genuinely believe that people should be free to do what they want to do. And if you follow any of my tenets, it would imply that between 18 and 35, men who are in the dating marketplace need not spend any time on a particular relationship. You should simply have your needs met when you need those needs to be fulfilled, but concentrate on yourself. Spend about 95% of your time on your goals, your dreams, your vision, achieving financial freedom, developing a career, your education, and spend about 5% on relationships. However, we know that when people meet, it usually starts off casually and it blossoms into something more substantial and something more tangible. Now, the inspiration for the interracial conversation was something that came to me whilst I was in the gym. A young boy, he must be in his 20s, mid-20s. We started talking and he said to me that he was going to be getting married. This was after we had conversed for a short while, that he was going to be getting married sometime later this year. And he said to me that his girlfriend was African, Southern African, I think, somewhere from the southern part of Africa. And I asked him a question. I said, great. Where is she from? He mentioned. I said, have you visited? He said, no. I said, have you met her parents? He said, no. I said, have you visited Africa? He said, no. Now, initially, when he said to me, I said, where is she from? He said, Africa. To which I responded, yeah, but that is a continent. Where in Africa is she from? And then he identified that. Now, when I wished him the best of luck, and that was it. But as I left, I realized that some of the questions that I had asked, he had no clue. He seemed like a very, very lovely young man. But in a similar way, I realized that I had observed, in this case, in this particular instance, it was a Caucasian man from Eastern Europe who was going to be getting married to a Southern African woman. My experience has been, in the majority, this is actually the first exception that I have encountered, but my experience has been it's usually an African man or a British African, an African American, but usually the man is the one who has the African ethnicity or lineage, who is marrying a Caucasian woman. Now, I have a number of friends who have married out of their ethnic group. Usually the man marries into a Caucasian woman, usually Eastern Europeans, or primarily Anglo-Saxon women. Eastern Europeans meaning the Slavic countries and the Baltic countries, and the Anglo-Saxon English primarily, or British women. But what I found from my conversation with this young man was something that I have also observed when I interact with people who I know or I am acquainted to, either directly or through a third party. I have found that the decision was made very trivially. And so what I'd like to do is share some of my thoughts on some of the things to keep in mind and take into consideration, because I have found that very few people really do any thinking about the decision they're making. It's made very casually and wrongly, in my opinion. And I will try in today's session to identify some of what I think should be questions that you should try and answer before progressing into something significant or serious. In this case, I am going to be looking out for the kids. We know the whole saying, you should look out for the orphans and the widows. Usually two adults who come together, who have made a decision to spend their lives together, or to spend their lives temporarily together, are old enough and mature enough to live with the consequences of their decision. We as society generally, we step forward when a decision by two mutual adults creates a third party who does not have the ability to speak for themselves, for which there could be unintended consequences. And so in today's session, I am going to be focusing on the impact such arrangements have on kids, but also the impact it will have on both parties. What I will try to do, perhaps not in today's session, is address two separate scenarios. The first would be where you have, in this case, I will use I'll use the word black, a black man who is getting married to a white woman. And then there will be a separate session where I will talk about a white man getting married to a black woman. Both are not the same. Very important to understand the importance of sequence or semantics. I might say to you, Johnny bit the dog, and I could also say the dog bit Johnny. They're not quite the same. Same words, but positioned slightly differently. Now, what I will try to show is that both scenarios, though similar, have unique, subtle differences. But let me begin today by saying, over the last few years, it came to my observation, especially over the last, I would say, 2 years, particularly, although I've made this observation across 2 to 7, 8 years, it's come to my observation that there is what I think is a significant problem we have in our nations. Part of the problem comes to do with the issue of self-image and self-identity. We do not have, like, I'll use London for example. Most of the crimes committed, violent crimes, specifically violent attacks on other people, killings, stabbings, are perpetrated by a certain demographic. Interestingly, that demographic usually falls to the black population, despite their overall base percentage of the entire population. Overwhelmingly, they are responsible for a certain amount of the crime. In my interaction with a lot of young men, I have found that there are two issues that come to mind. One is that most of these young men do not have fathers in the family. That's the first. So there's an absence of fathers. But secondly, what I have found is there is a void in the lives of these boys where they do not know or have an idea or concept of their self-identity or self-image. So many of them are joining gangs because they're looking for an identity. The father is not in the house, or sometimes when the father is present, and this is where the interracial relationships come into play, they have come from a mixed family. Mixed meaning different ethnic compositions. And there is a confusion that exists where the young boy is not really quite sure where he and who he is. Many people will relate to this frustration. For example, a black man marries a white woman and they have a child. And in terms of, and I hate to use this, but I will, in terms of melanin content, in terms of his skin color, he falls in between. He's not black enough to be considered to be part of the black group, but he's not white enough to be considered to be white. So here he is, confused. And I have found that in a lot of young men and young women, there is a loss of self-identity and self-concept, self-worth, but most importantly, there is almost a failure by both parents to instill in the kids the importance of their true ethnic identity. And by ethnic identity, I'm not referring to one identity only. I'm talking about both parents, the lineage of both families, so that the child knows fully well where both parents have come from. In some of the cases I have seen, the child knows about one, because I'm referring to people who are in Britain. A lot of them have come from Anglo-Saxon women or European women who have married out to men who have an ethnic image from Africa. A lot of these boys have never been to Africa. You see the same issue in the United States, where you have the whole concept of being African American. And there's a confusion in so many young men, even older men. They call themselves African American. They don't understand that Africa is a continent, is not a country. Many of them have never been to Africa. Many of them were born in the United States or born in Great Britain. They were born by parents, perhaps one of which, or both of which, in this case I'll use one, was born in Great Britain, but they've never been to Africa. They know that they are Africans. They know one half of them is African, but they cannot tell you where from Africa they have come from, or where their parents, or where their lineage has come from. So in today's session, the point I'm trying to make is, whilst looking out for the young kids, I would try to address a few things that should be considered by both parties before love takes over. Recognize that there are some important questions that you should ask. There are some important actions that you must take to ensure that you don't make mistakes. Now, if both of you, in this case the man has had a vasectomy and the woman has had a sterilization and both cannot have kids, then I jolly well have no concern for what you do with your lives, because you cannot reproduce. Unfortunately, because there is a risk that you can reproduce, I use the word risk intentionally to provoke an emotion. The risk that you can reproduce means that you should take a step back and think about the consequences of that risk and whether you've thought about the unintended consequences, not just the necessary consequences, but the unintended consequences. Now let me begin with ethnicity in Africa. There is a myth about the continent of Africa. The myth I have seen both in the United States, in Europe, in Great Britain, and in most parts out of or away from Africa. For a start, people think Africa is a country. When I say to people that there are 54 countries in Africa, and Africa is a continent, there is a look on their faces as though I'm speaking a different language. For a start, in terms of size, most people's understanding of Africa comes from the Mercator map, which is wrong, simply because of how it distributes the countries depending on whether it's closer to sea, closer to the equator, or whether it's far from the equator. Africa in itself is portrayed wrongly. To put in perspective, using sizes that most people can relate to, if you took the whole of China and you took the whole of Russia and you took all of Eastern Europe and part of Western Europe, we throw in Germany, France, Spain, and you took Japan, and you took the island of Great Britain and you included Ireland, you could fit all of those countries into Africa and you will still have a lot more space left. That is how huge Africa is. It's enormous. Secondly, the concept we have, or most people have, of Africa is that it's a race of people who are all the same. Nothing can be further from the truth. We have different ethnic groups. For a start, there is North, there is South, there is East, there is West. But we have different ethnic groups, and certainly we have ethnic issues. There's a feeling there once you see a black person and you say he's African, then we're all the same. No, we have different cultures, we have different values, we have different morals, we have different religions, languages, we have different histories. As a matter of fact, we were colonized by different masters. When I talk to people, I say, using Nigeria, for example, if you were to look at the African map and you would look at Nigeria and you would see Benin and Togo and Cameroon, you would, because these countries are close or next to Nigeria, you might be forced to think that we have more in common. Nigeria has more in common with Cameroon and Togo and Benin than the other countries that are further apart. But that is wrong. As a matter of fact, Nigerians and Ghanaians have more of a closer bond than the countries we share a border with. Part of that reason is simply because we both were colonized by Great Britain. Ghana was colonized by Great Britain. Nigeria was colonized by Great Britain. So in many ways, what you start to find is that part of our history and our culture in Africa is intrinsically linked to our colonial masters. And that means part of our language is connected to our colonial masters. We speak English in Nigeria because we were part of Her Majesty's kingdom. Ghana speaks English because it was part of Her Majesty's kingdom. The likes of Togo and Ivory Coast were colonized by different countries. So we have Italy, we have Belgium, we have France, we have Spain. All of these were colonial masters. And so in parts of Africa, some speak French, some speak English, some even have some element of Portuguese, some understand Spanish. The reason I explain all of this is to start with the importance of understanding that when you're engaging or interacting or you're dating someone who has an ethnic image similar to someone who is from Africa, there are some questions that have to be considered. What is his religion? What is her language? For example, in terms of language, the Arabic language is the most spoken language in Africa. Next to that is Hausa. Hausa is spoken by the Muslims. This brings me to religion. Muslims are the largest and projected to be significantly larger over the next 40 years in Africa. So it's important to understand that when we date casually. When we decide to couple together, we are merging two lives. I have said before that when you have a wedding or a marriage, it is the death of two people and the birth of a union of two. What that means usually is you're merging two religions, two languages, two ethnic groups, two histories, two struggles, two visions, and you're trying to merge it into one. Most of the time, it works, but it usually works when there are similarities. An Anglo-Saxon can very happily get married to someone who is Irish, because there is a similarity in history. You can have a Welsh get married to someone who is a Scot. Again, similarities in history. However, there are still subtle lineage issues. Now I know this because I have observed friends and people I know who within Great Britain have come from different parts of the Union. Some were Scottish, some were Welsh, some were English. And you can still see that tension that exists, because the person who is Scottish wants to hold on to their true history. And the spouse that is Welsh also wants to hold on to their true history and identity. The point I'm making is this: identity is not something that you can easily paint over without certain repercussions, especially mental and subconscious. So it's important to understand the history of the people, the history of the person that you are getting married to. Even though the person, and now we use Great Britain for example, even though the person may have been born in the country from where you were born. So you have two people, a young man, a young woman, both born in Great Britain. So they identify as British because they were born in Great Britain. However, one of them has a lineage, an ethnicity, which is African. It's important to understand the history of the African lineage, but it's very important to understand the history of the British lineage. So ethnic issues play a very, very, very important role. And I have made the observation that in most cases, and I have to be careful when I say this because most people who are either married already and happily married might disagree with me, but here is a statement. You do not know someone until you have visited them, and you visited them on or in their land. So when you're dating someone who is from a different country, a different land, a different ethnicity, a different religion, where you met them, usually, assuming it's in a different continent or country to their ethnicity, where you meet them is usually a neutral ground. People can live two lives. They can live a surface life whereby we blend into the environment we find ourselves. As the saying goes, when in Rome, you behave like a Roman. So people mirror the behaviors they see around them in order to be accepted into the group. However, some people subconsciously are different. And once you remove the person away from that environment, you're exposed to something that is completely different. As a matter of fact, you might be shocked at the behaviors you start to observe, the mannerisms you start to witness. You might be shocked at some of the stories about the person that you may not have known. Now, in many cases, there are situations whereby people have fled, maybe their place of birth, for various reasons. Sometimes it has to do with asylum. Sometimes it has to do with a past that they want to avoid for the rest of their lives. They may have committed crimes. They may have done things that were not human or were inhumane. And they start again. Everyone is entitled to start again. However, if you are going to be joining and forming a union with someone, it's important you understand where they are coming from. Now, most men are running from a pain that they want to forget. Some men are running from a past that they wish to erase, are content with their past, their present, and are happy to share the dreams they have of the future. It's important to distinguish where the person you intend to spend time with falls into, which of the three groups. Now, you would never know until you visit them on their land. Now, when I talk about their land, I'm talking about in their natural state. I'll give you a good example. If you were to take me to where my father was born, as soon as I arrive, irrespective of how I converse with them, if I said nothing, there will be a welcome that I receive as the son of the soil. Most cultures that are not westernized will understand this statement. There's a feeling of the son of the soil has arrived, or the daughter of the soil has arrived. So when I refer to meeting them on their land, I'm speaking about geographically meeting them on their land. But I'm also talking about meeting them in the environment that draws out from them the subconscious mannerisms, cultures, behaviors, and traits, some of which you've never seen. Now, what this simply means And I'm not suggesting that people who are from Africa have something to hide. I have found, in my experience, as a matter of fact, that seldom would you meet people who are more proud of where they're from. Like Africans. We are from the soil. We're very proud of the soil because we know where we're from. Now, obviously, there are people who were born and who've come through different experiences who do not know their lineage. But when you meet someone who understands his lineage, there's a pride that comes with that person. I have found that in the modern West, there is a shame that people of the soil in the West, let me use very specific terms, the Anglo-Saxons are almost embarrassed and shamed and shameful of their history and their past. Now, my view is always, you take the good with the bad and the ugly, and that's who you are, blood and soil. Doesn't matter what it is, that is who you are. So I'm not referring to in my conversation a feeling that those who are Africans have an issue. No. You see the same issue with the Chinese. You see it with the South Koreans. You see the same issues with the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Sri Lankans. It doesn't matter where you are from. We have histories. We have cultures. We have a value system. And sometimes we move away from our base and we forget who we are. We leave and we lead a life that is different to our true culture. And sometimes it takes a return back to the land, the motherland, whether that be geographically or whether that be by environment or association. It takes a return for the scales to fall off your eyes. In many cases, some people are simply living a double life. In some other cases, they're living a life that they had to live in order to be accepted. I make no judgment. I really don't care. This is not a philosophical conversation. It's not a moral position I'm taking. But here is the point. Acceptance. There has to be a need, and you should make an observation as to whether you have been accepted. Irrespective of what position in the relationship you fall into. You've come from an African heritage. Your other half has to accept your history, your culture, your lineage, even the sins. And you have to accept their history, their culture, and even their sins. I'm going to use something that I think is slightly controversial. It shouldn't be, but we live in a society today where people generally, rather than count their blessings, they count their unfulfilled expectations. In the UK, if we have an immigrant come into the country, in order for the immigrant's life to be fulfilled to the best possible level, in order for the person to lead the best life, there are 4 steps that always have to take place. I found this to be consistent, irrespective of the country or the continent. If you are a migrant, in other words, you either moving to another place or you're marrying. This applies to marrying into another culture. There are 4 steps. And whenever these 4 steps have been done properly, there is success. Education, integration, assimilation, and intermarriage. If you go back to perhaps the first test where this was conducted, it was in the United States, at the very early stages of the United States. And people were brought in stages. They recognized that they needed a generation, a 30-year period. And so they brought in people, especially when America had arrived at a place where immigration had to be restricted because there were issues to do with the ability for the state to provide welfare. Prior to the welfare state in the United States, immigration was open. Following the creation of a welfare state, it became important to restrict immigration because they needed to ensure that the people that came will come into the United States because they wanted to be there, as opposed to people who were coming simply to live off the state. And it was a step-by-step process. Most people came not understanding the language. So the first thing was to educate them, both in the language and in the history and culture of the people. The second was integration, putting them in places whereby they could connect, feed off the existing population, but also allow them to bring their culture and bless the United States with their culture. So integration is not a one-way street. It's something that happens both ways, recognizing that the primacy is the home culture, the home values, the home morals, and the history and the law of that land. Next was assimilation. Getting people, for example, kids to go to American schools, not segregating them into places where people were similar to and who had the same ethnic image. Assimilation was very important. And if you carried out the three processes, what you found was that it led to the fourth, which is intermarrying, where people married across cultures. And the more you intermarried, the more you brought together people. Cultures merged, and then suddenly you were no longer an Italian American or an Irish American. You were simply an American. You were educated as an American, you spoke the language, you were integrated with the society, you were fully assimilated, and you had intermarried. So you were an American. And this was partly why the African American people in the United States have a real problem. In my opinion, Great Britain has done it very, very well. We do not use adjectives to describe someone who is a Brit. We do not say, I'm British French. Some people do, but generally we just simply say we are British. It's very simple. There is no such thing as African British or British African. No, you're either African or you are British. Now, you can have dual nationality, something I'm more than happy to talk about later. But by being British, we identify as one, irrespective of your place of birth, irrespective of your lineage, irrespective of where your parents were born, where they were raised, where you studied, your education, your social class. We are British. The Queen of Great Britain, according to the laws of the land, is no more British than I am. That's how powerful the system is. Everyone is treated as equals. We're equal before the law. We have equal rights. The systems are set up that everyone is considered the same. However, in the United States, unfortunately, they held on to the whole concept of African American, creating a system whereby it was we versus them. In any case, I digress. The point I am trying to make with these four steps: education, integration, assimilation, and intermarriage is, in the dating game, what we find is that most people skip the first three stages and they go to marriage first. They haven't been educated on the culture, the people. Some have never visited the land. They're not integrated. They cannot tell you anything about their spouse and the history. They haven't been assimilated into the culture. Some are even embarrassed by the culture, yet they are married. Now this creates a real interesting dilemma, because providing you remain in the West, in the developed West, and providing there are no issues with the relationship or in the relationship, then everything should work out well. Ceteris paribus, all things remaining equal. We know nothing ever remains equal. If you get married in the West today, there's 1 in 2 marriages will end in divorce. In the UK, within the first 7 years, there will be a divorce. The younger you are, the higher the likelihood that it will be much higher. As a matter of fact, those who get married in the early 20s seldom make it to the 7th year of their marriage before they have a divorce. So the divorce rate is much higher for younger people. 7 out of 10 marriages and marriages where you have a divorce filing is done by the woman. So the women generally are more unhappy in their marriages. Now this brings me to a very interesting dilemma, where I bring it back to today's conversation. This means that if you're intermarrying and you've had a child in your marriage, and the statistic says that there will be a divorce, you're going to have a broken family at some point in the future. That's what the data says. The first question to ask yourself is, if I am more likely to be the norm than the exception, then how do I prepare to ensure that my offsprings are not affected negatively when the divorce takes place? Now we know the impact divorce has on kids. My observation has been, amongst interracial couples, the effect is worse for the following reasons, and hear me out on this. I'll go back to the example I started with, the Eastern European man, young man, and the Southern African, not from South Africa, but from the southern part of Africa, the young lady. And I'm going to contrast that with the same man marrying someone who is a Caucasian. If a Caucasian man marries a Caucasian woman, and they have a child, a son, the son will be Caucasian, both in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of his looks. This means if the marriage ends in a divorce, although most men do not want to raise other people's offsprings, if the woman finds another husband, it's much easier in relation to social acceptance. It's much easier for the new man to take his wife's son under his wings, because they look, in terms of skin color and initial impression, they look the same. On the other hand, if we use an Eastern European man or a Caucasian white man and a black African woman, the child will be a mixture of both colors. You have a dilemma. The child has a very, very troubled future ahead of him in the event of a divorce. The reason being, if she is married a white man and she decides to put herself back into the marketplace, there is a very interesting dilemma, and I think today's session, this is perhaps the most important part of today's session. There is a very important dilemma that presents itself. The next man on the line, should he put himself forward, has a problem. firstly, if he is Caucasian, you would need a very rare man who decides to raise a black child. Now, I don't care what people say. I agree that ethnicity comes from the father, but the ethnic image of an African interracial couple is very strong. And that means the Caucasian man that has come into the picture will have troubles raising this child who is a black boy. Firstly, he doesn't know the father. Secondly, he doesn't know the history, the culture, the ethnicity. He knows nothing about the child. So he has to have a lot of interest in education, integration, assimilation. And all of that he will be doing for a child that is not his. In other words, the extra luggage he has to carry might be too heavy for his shoulders. On the other hand, if she decides to find a man with an ethnic image similar to her son's, in this case a black man, you have even a much bigger problem. African men, and I use African, recognize it, I'm generalizing because it's a continent, it's not a country. But I will tell you specifically, from my experience, those who share the ethnic image of Africans, and by Africans recognizing Africans, the northern part of Africa are not dark skinned. I'm referring to the dark skinned northern part of Africa, west, east, central, south. Primarily, the sub-Saharan Africans are dark skinned, but as you move to north, you start to see some more lighter skinned colors, like in Egypt. In any case, a black man is a very proud man. He will not, except in very, very rare occasions, and for very exceptional men, he will not take on another man's son. And he will not take on another man's son who does not share his ethnic image. It's an issue to do with ego, pride, how his culture would perceive him, etc. Now, for men who are westernized, then there are exceptions, no doubt. Now, this leaves a very, very strange and interesting dilemma, because we know that when fathers leave the house, the lives of children, both men and women, are ruined. But what happens when the father leaves and the new man that attempts to come into the family does not accept the child? Or, as the child starts to grow old, he does not accept the stepfather, because the stepfather doesn't look like him. And this is where you see things such as bullying and him joining a gang because he's looking for someone that looks like him, him finding other role models that are not necessarily good. Again, this is not a reflection. I'm not referring to the character of the man in question who comes in to play a stepfather role. I'm talking about reality here, because most people do not think about some of these issues. Mothers, once they've gone through a divorce, are usually the worst in selecting the right role models for their sons or their daughters. I might cover that in a different session, and I'll share my reasons why. But here is the second thing to consider, which is what happens in the event of death in the family. Let's say, in this case, one person dies. Let's make it a little bit more graphic. The woman is married to a black man. And let's say he dies. Is she received? Because here's an important statement to make. When a woman gets married, traditionally, she moves from her father to her husband. There's a transfer of responsibility. But generally, and historically, she joins her husband's family. The man doesn't join the woman's family. She joins her husband's family. What if he dies? Will his family accept her as their daughter? Now, a very important statement, but one that should be made and not one that should be considered. It comes down to the 4-step process: education, integration, assimilation, intermarriage. We are jumping the 3 steps to get to the 4th without realizing that the foundation is weak. Now, if there is a love for the culture, and if the man in question had taken the time to bring the woman into his culture, or the woman in question had taken the time to bring the man into their culture, then that should not be an issue. There is a selfishness that occurs in the West, whereby one person dies or gets divorced and they move on very quickly without realizing, you're intertwined with, and spiritually and physically and emotionally, mentally, with someone else, dead or alive. And it's important to understand whether your love for their culture transcends whatever shortcomings that culture might have. Now the way I've painted this, I've used different colors, white and black, to make it more graphic. I will tell you this, as someone who is familiar with ethnic issues. Let's take Nigeria, for example. There are 3 or 4, usually it was 3, but lately it's become 4 because population growth. But usually, historically, we have 3 primary tribes: Igbos, Hausas, and Yorubas. Today, we also have the Fulanis, who have actually become, in population, a significant tribe. And I often smile when I hear about race issues and the issue of racism in the West. And I laugh, because anyone who is familiar with Africa knows that ethnic and tribal issues can be very violent and far exceeds anything that we see in the developed West in relation to racism and race issues. Tribalism and ethnicity and ethnic issues can be very, very strong. And I have seen people who have married in the same country, from the same country, but have married across different tribes, across different ethnic groups. And I've seen families disown one of theirs because they've married out of their ethnic group. The point I'm making is what happens when there is a divorce? What happens when there's a death in the family? The woman usually leaves to join the man. But what if in her leaving, she breaks all the ties that she has with her family, and there is a divorce? Where does she go back to? And if there are kids involved, who does she take the kids back to? Put it in a different way. The man leaves his family and tribe and cleaves to the woman, and there is a death in the family. Who does he return to? And where does he take the kids to? Some important questions to keep in mind. It's important to keep some of the things I've said to heart. I don't think I have the answers to some of the questions that I have put forward. I'll conclude, let me try and conclude today's session by very briefly talking about something that I think is trivialized or not really understood. There is a distinction and a difference between your ethnicity and your citizenship or your nationality. The 3 are not synonymous terms. You can be Anglo-Saxon by ethnic image, but you can be a citizen of the United States. And you can be a nationality could be dual. We conflate the 3 terms: ethnicity, nationality, and citizenship. They're not the same. I am ethnically Nigerian. Blood and soil. You can take my name and you can trace my name to a particular street, in a particular village, in a particular town, from where my lineage and my forefathers have come from. The name itself will take you to a particular street and a particular house. As a matter of fact, no one else, no people, no ethnic group, tribe uses my last name because it's distinctively linked to a particular group of people from a particular tribe, particular village, particular town, particular state. That's ethnicity, blood and soil. Even if I have kids who are mixed race, who have kids who are mixed race, and it continues till they become white. The lineage leads, all roads lead back to Nigeria. Not Africa, Nigeria, my hometown. So I am ethnically Nigerian, but in terms of my nationality and citizenship, I'm British. How do you reconcile both? Now, I'm proud of who I am and my lineage, so I am Nigerian and British. You have to reconcile that. And what that simply means is my kids have to be raised, number one, to love the culture, the people, the history, the values, and the sins. Now, I use the word sins and love together because you have to own it. I'm familiar with the phrase, I usually say this, and this is something that's come from the books of antiquities, particularly the Bible, where God says, I love you, but I hate your sinful ways. So he distinguishes between you, the individual, and the acts that you've committed. My kids would have to love where their father is from. But make no mistake, my kids would have to be love and will be taught to love the culture, the history, the sins, the lineage of where their mother is from. Two cultures. And guess what? One of the things I had to reconcile in my heart, an important decision when you're choosing a spouse or choosing a mate, is how much they love your culture, how much they're happy to educate themselves, assimilate, integrate. Intermarrying should be the least of the problems. And if you find someone who knows about your culture just as well as you do, certainly they cannot know everything, but when I say as well, I'm talking about someone who has the passion. You've found something special. And here is the reason as I conclude. Women are normally called the scribes. They are the ones who transmit culture. Men, we die. Women outlive men. Always have. I think always will. Which means that the story has to be transmitted from one generation to the next. And usually the women are the ones who tell the story, which is why women are nurturers. So the story she has about the father, his culture, his people, his history, very important. But the man, on the other hand, has to be educated enough, and he must love the culture of the mother just as well, because he has a responsibility in terms of forming and fashioning the self-image of the kids. A good example, some time ago I was down in Wales, and I was with a family. The man was Welsh, the mother was French. I noticed a very interesting dilemma. They had a child, well, they had a son and a daughter. The boy bonded with the father, the girl bonded with the mother. The mum spoke to the daughter in French only. The father spoke to his son in Welsh. Now both kids spoke Welsh and French. But I noticed it was as though this was us against them. The father certainly played with the son, but it was all about Welsh and the Welsh people. No problem. But I could see that they were choosing sides. The mother was choosing the French side because she was not willing to lose her identity, her culture, her history. The father was doing the same. That is wrong. There has to be a consensus whereby you say both cultures, both histories, both people will be equally relevant to the kids. You should not choose a default position. As a matter of fact, you should train both kids on a neutral basis. And when they get to 18 years, they get to choose. But the key thing should always be the father should love the mother's people, culture, just as much as he loves her. And the mother should love the father's people and culture just as much as she loves him.